Welcome to introductory lecture to give you a sense of some of my research interests. I'm Rachel Epstein. I teach a number of things at the Korbel School, but the main thing I'm known for is actually teaching the Introduction to International Political Economy courses, which I offer 2 sections of every fall. And if you join us next fall, hopefully I'll see some of you in that course. I'm also the director of the degree in international security, and I also co-direct the Center for the Study of Europe and the World. So I'm going to combine those 3 interests today in my lecture, which is on the European debt crisis and the implications that the European debt crisis has for transatlantic security. Just to give you a little bit of background, if you weren't in the security meeting yesterday, most of my research has actually been on post-communist transition in Eastern Europe. And in particular, when I started that research in the 1990s, I was interested in how the international organizations, including NATO, the European Union, the IMF, the World Bank, how all of those organizations would affect countries that were trying to move from central planning economically and also political authoritarianism to free market enterprise and democracy. From my point of view, for both NATO and the European Union, that's been a critically important project. That is, democratizing and marketizing Central Eastern Europe has been a critically important project, not only for the welfare of advanced industrialized democracies, including the United States, but also has really strong security implications, because that region of Europe has been a hotbed of conflict for a very long time. So to the extent that the international organizations could resolve some of the regional rivalries and hopefully also contain Russian expansionism, I thought it would be all to the better. My main argument about the European debt crisis today is that some of those positive developments of the 1990s and also the first decade of the 21st century, I believe are now coming under threat. And I was just at General Casey's talk, so I know that he doesn't think that moving military, U.S. military presence out of the region is necessarily a danger, and I don't disagree with him. But I am concerned about the security implications of the severe kind of economic deprivation that potentially accompanies the European debt crisis. So there are 3 things that I want to talk about. Actually 4 things. So the first thing I'm going to do is just give you a very brief background about what the European debt crisis is, why it started, and why it's taking the form that it is, which is primarily, in most people's mind, to present a threat to the common currency, which 17 European countries currently use, the euro. So I'll talk a little bit about why that started, why it's taken the form it has. Then I'm going to talk about the direct implications for NATO, which somebody at General Casey's talk asked about in a kind of indirect way, that is, what are NATO countries doing to bolster their capabilities in light of the Libya operation, which sent very mixed signals about the alliance's capability. Then I want to talk about it in more, that is, the effects of the financial crisis in more general terms with respect to the European democratic project in Eastern Europe. And in countries like Hungary in particular right now, I don't know if you follow East European politics, but I do quite closely, developments in the Hungarian political scene right now are very negative from a democratic consolidation perspective. And then lastly, I want to talk about what the financial crisis, which started in the United States, moved to Europe and to the rest of the world, what that means for Western democratic cooperation and global power more generally. Okay? So I know I only have 20 minutes, so I know that's a lot to cover in 20 minutes, so I'll try to keep track of time so that I can take your questions. So let me first start with the European debt crisis. Have you guys been following the European debt crisis? This has been going on probably since you were teenagers by this time. I mean, it's really, the United States financial crisis really starts in the summer of 2007. And it starts because we, in this country, developed new financial instruments that were very difficult to regulate. And the one I'm going to pinpoint for the purposes of this discussion is mortgage-backed securities. Okay. When in 2006 and 2007, interest rates in this country started to readjust upwards, it became increasingly difficult for a number of American homeowners to make their mortgage payments. That was really the beginning of the disaster in 2006, 2007. And as it becomes clear how widely held these mortgage-backed securities are, how widely distributed they are, not just in the United States, but also globally. And as it becomes clear that people are going to have trouble paying their mortgages, suddenly the value of those securities is called into question. And nobody's really sure who owns these or how much they own. And that is the thing that then really infuses the whole financial system with anxiety and doubt. And that is the thing then that is the trigger for financial institutions to stop lending to other financial institutions. And essentially, that is the 3-second story behind Lehman Brothers' collapse in September of 2008. And that's when the financial crisis really takes on a different scope and a kind of enormity, the consequences of which nobody really anticipated. Even people who said, look, we think there's a housing bubble in the United States, it's potentially dangerous. I don't think anybody could have forecast how widespread and damaging that US financial crisis would be. It spreads to Europe immediately. And what you hear about with respect to the European financial crisis now is mostly to do with Greece, Portugal, Ireland. To a certain extent also we hear about Italy and Spain now. But of the West European countries, it's Greece, Ireland, and Portugal that get hit the hardest and first in Western Europe. But actually, before those countries were hit, a series of East European countries required IMF and EU bailouts first. The first country was actually Hungary. The second country was Latvia. And then there was also Romania, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and Serbia. And essentially, the contagion that went from North America to Europe was a fairly simple channel, which is that European banks, unfortunately, given the credit ratings agency's assessment of U.S. mortgage-backed securities as being very highly rated, bought a lot of those securities themselves. So when you're thinking about the effects of globalization on contagion of financial crisis, it's through this particular channel, that is the ability of European financial institutions to buy U.S. securities that suddenly are of doubtful value. That's the transmission mechanism. Then, when it comes to the sovereign debt crisis, which we currently talk about in the European context, the economic downturn that is catalyzed by the financial contagion is a disaster for the financial status of European states. Because in an economic downturn, what we know happens, among other things, is that investment contracts, employment contracts, tax receipts of governments therefore drop precipitously in a crisis. At the same time, particularly if you're talking about European welfare states, their obligations to pay out increase. And so, in countries like Greece, like Spain, like Italy, these countries, which at the beginning of the crisis already were overextended with respect to their debt positions, suddenly find themselves bringing in less revenue and having to pay out more money. Now, there are a couple different scenarios for how particular states got into trouble. What I just described more closely, I think, explains the Greek situation, with the caveat that even before the crisis started, Greece already had a huge debt load, right? So we're talking about Greece before the crisis going to a debt to GDP load from about 100% to 160 to 180% during the crisis. So that's one scenario. And the EU and the common currency, they have rules about what the maximum debt load can be. Greece was already in violation of the crisis. Okay, so that's an extreme example. The other scenario through which particular European countries got into trouble had to do with severe banking sector exposure to property bubbles. And this is really the case of Ireland. And what happened in Ireland is that the financial institutions in Ireland borrowed tons and tons of money from overseas, invested it into real estate. The real estate bubble popped. Those banks then are not in a position to collect the money that's owed to them. And in that case, then, the government actually nationalized the banks and essentially then took on all of the bad loans that those banks were not going to be able to recoup their principal or interest from, essentially. To a certain extent, then, I mean, both dynamics were important in every European country's debt and deficit difficulties. But you can see how also the assumption of banks' bad loans in Europe also contributes to the financial difficulties of states. So they're paying out unemployment benefits. Their states are paying out what are called automatic stabilizers. These are meant to be counter-cyclical payments in an economy in an economic downturn to help stimulate economic activity. Plus, they're taking on the financial burden of banks' bad decisions. And it's not just in the Irelands of Europe where the banks are actually nationalized by the state, but also in basically every West European country, bank bailouts were required and those were expensive. So that, in a nutshell, is how the financial crisis spread from North America to Europe. The common currency then comes under threat simply because it's not clear when states get into this level of financial difficulty whether those states will be able to pay off their obligations. Right, so when you're talking about a country like Greece, which is a relatively, I mean, it's a very small part of European GDP actually. It's somewhere between 2 and 3% of European GDP. And so you might wonder, why is it that a tiny country can threaten to unravel the entire project? And it's because if Greece can't pay back its obligations, either on its own or even with the assistance of the IMF and the European Union, then there is question in the global economy generally about whether the currency, the euro, which Greece uses, has credibility. If foreign investors and international business people generally believe that a country like Greece is not going to be able to pay back its obligations, either independently or with assistance, then there is essentially the risk for the whole Eurozone that there will be massive capital and investment flight from the European economy. And that would be economically ruinous for the European community, both in terms of the Eurozone members, but also for their major trading partners, which are other European countries, not necessarily in the Eurozone, but in the European Union. So essentially what happens in a country like Greece, or Portugal, or Spain, or Italy, is because there is doubt among investors about whether these countries will be able to pay their obligations back, suddenly investors want to charge much more to lend them money, right? So whereas the American government today can issue 10-year U.S. securities at an interest rate of about 2.2%, at certain points during the financial crisis, Greece would have had to pay the equivalent of 70% for such a security to be issued. At even 7%, governments in the European Union can't fund their obligations sustainably. It becomes too expensive. Once you get up to 7% annual interest, it becomes very difficult for governments to be able to afford to roll over their debts. And that's that in a nutshell. I'm quite impressed with myself because I managed to explain the European debt crisis in about 7 minutes, 10 minutes. That in a nutshell is what's happened and why the euro has come under threat. Okay. So I've told you about the origins of the crisis, the transmissions of the crisis, the particular manifestation it takes in the European context, which is to compromise the fiscal positions of a number of European states and why that then puts the euro into question. So then what does this have to do with transatlantic security? Why would this affect NATO? Do you guys have any ideas about that? Having looked at the Libya operation, what's the effect?
Well, I mean, if you think about Germany as kind of politically, from a political perspective, the people are kind of sick of carrying the water for everybody else. Therefore, you know, that might lead them to disengage from NATO operations, both in terms of cost, political will, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, they've had a hard time, I'd say, getting engaged in the first place, Germany. But here, it's the financial aspect and the idea of carrying the water for everybody else, which I think is particularly important, yes.
And I guess more generally across the entire NATO area, which I mean, NATO and European Union are mostly synonymous, that just because everyone's having these financial difficulties and money's so suddenly tight, there are, I mean, defense budgets were already so small, what else can they spare to spend? It's not, it's like the NATO credibility and capability is suddenly like cut in half, like, or more for any potential future operations.
That is the problem. I mean, that is really the crux of the issue. And when General Casey said a few minutes ago, he wasn't sure what they'd done in the meantime since Libya to try to boost the situation or improve NATO's capability. I mean, the problem is, if you're talking about a country like Spain, and Spain is not a country which has had to avail itself of an international bailout, at least not yet. It has a debt to GDP ratio which is around 70%. You know, but it has some other underlying fundamental problems like youth unemployment, which in some age categories is as high as 40%. And it has had public sector salary cuts of 17% across the board already. So when you go to a country like Spain, to NATO, and say, look, we really need you to meet the 2% GDP spending threshold that the alliance has for you, that's a very tough sell in this environment. And I think that the risk is, particularly from the United States' point of view, and if you listen to Secretary Gates' comments about the alliance as he was leaving, you know this. From the United States' point of view, it's kind of the German problem that was expressed a minute ago. Does the United States really want to continue to carry the water for everybody else with respect to funding the alliance's military capability? So just in terms of pure material consequences, the financial crisis, which is going to still take many years to resolve, has put extremely intense budgetary pressure on the United States' main military partners. It doesn't matter if you're talking about Spain or the UK or France or Germany. None of them are in a strong position at this point to make the case to their publics that funding military capability in the transatlantic alliance, which in my view is the most successful military alliance ever, and very important in securing a post-war democratic order, it's still a hard case to make to European populations. This is something that they should be spending money on at this point. So that's the first point about the effect of the financial crisis on security. It just leaves less money for military capability. The second thing I would say is that the European Union has been so fixated on these problems to do with the financial crisis, and particularly about Greece, that anti-democratic developments in Eastern Europe have essentially gotten very little attention. And what I'm referring to here is that in Central and Eastern Europe, since 2004, the European Union has admitted 10 post-communist countries. And for the most part, I would say with the exception of Czechoslovakia, those countries did not have a democratic background. And even in Czechoslovakia's case, right, so talking about Czechoslovakia, the interwar period, of course now it's 2 countries, but even in that country's case, their experience with democratic governance was at most 20 years, okay? And everybody else who had any democratic experience, it lasted between 2 and 5 years, essentially, before World War II. So what we're talking about are countries, even though they're European, with very little democratic experience, relatively shallow democratic institutions, and populations who are understandably prone to conflate economic chaos and privation with democratic governance, and therefore likely to gravitate towards politicians who will promise state solutions to economic problems and to the perception of chaos. This scenario has actually played out almost exactly as I just described in Hungary, where in the midst of financial crisis, an authoritarian-leaning government won a supermajority in Hungary's parliament. The party is called Fidesz, and it's run by a guy named Viktor Orban. And since Fidesz came to power, they have taken a number of authoritarian measures with respect to the economy. But they've also taken some very strong political moves to limit democratic governance, particularly to limit the independence of the media, to limit the independence of the judiciary, and to redistrict the country in ways that will allow Fidesz to retain power in the medium term, if not the long term. So how does the financial crisis affect that? Well, for one thing, the economic crisis visits certain kinds of political chaos and I would say economic privation on Central Eastern European countries with weak democratic institutions. And then secondly, because the European Union is so focused on the problems in Greece and trying to negotiate a deal and try to reconfigure its institutions in order to support the euro, it doesn't do anything about democratic limits in a country like Hungary. In a different atmosphere, I think the European Union would be all over Hungary, ensuring that it wasn't passing a bunch of laws which were going to limit democratic practice. In fact, if you look at the EU accession process, the process through which post-communist countries were brought into the European Union was extremely strict. There's a lot of monitoring, a lot of reporting. We're not saying at this point because that's not where European energy is. This is a concern in terms of security because, as I said before, that region traditionally has been at war with itself, has treated minorities abysmally, has not been democratic. So from a security perspective, the fact that the European Union is in conflict with itself, fragmented and divided, I think is a very bad outcome for that democratic transition project, which I still consider to be very much underway in Central Eastern Europe. The last thing I'll say about the relationship between the financial crisis and security is the following. In international relations, thanks to people like Bob Cohane and Joseph Nye, people you might have read in your studies already, we have different kinds of conceptions about what constitutes power in the global polity and also in the global economy. And if we look at the funding for NATO as being a manifestation of material power, which in this phase of history seems to be waning because of economic crisis, there's also this issue of organizational power. And the issue of organizational power speaks to how quickly either a country or a community of countries can reach consensus and take action. And so I would argue with respect to the Western community of states, which tend to privilege democratic governance, free markets, and also human rights, that organizational capacity has been severely weakened by the financial crisis. Not just because the model by which Western advanced industrialized countries live has been called into question. I mean, the economic model certainly has been called into question. But also because when it comes to things like dealing with Iran, or dealing with Syria, or dealing with the Arab Spring in general, or dealing with trade negotiations, or trying to resolve the global imbalances which currently hinder the global economy's smooth functioning, all of that has become immensely more difficult by virtue of the financial crisis. So I think that the prolongation of the financial crisis also compromises Western democratic security interests just because our organizational power has been so severely undermined by the crisis. So I've probably talked long enough. I would like to take your questions. There's just one other final thought I would throw into the mix, which is that maybe ironically, there could be a small silver lining for the Americans in the European financial crisis, which is that it potentially prolongs the dollar's dominance as the world's major reserve currency. And that does have positive implications for Americans and also, more specifically, I think, for the American ability to continue to spend as much of the rest of the world combined on defense. I can explain why that is if you're interested. So thanks a lot for coming to this event and also for your attention. I appreciate it. I'm happy to take your questions. Yes?
I guess this might seem a bit of an extreme scenario, but do you see any potential for these anti-democratic developments and strife in East and Central Eastern Europe causing some sort of opening for Russia to re-extend some sort of sphere of influence there? Or just worm itself into worm its way into the cracks between European Union countries in that area?
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess I don't see that in the immediate future.
Because it does seem fairly extreme.
Well, it depends on what your definition of Russian intervention is. I mean, if I look at the Fidesz government, and I don't want to, I have a Hungarian research assistant who cautions me to not, be hysterical about Hungarian politics. But, if Russia looking at Hungarian politics today, they would think, if we're concerned about countries in our midst having belief systems which reflect our own, in my opinion, the Fidesz government is not inconsistent with what Putin is doing in Russia. That is to say, trying to consolidate power in the executive, trying to undermine the other institutions that are part of the government that would ordinarily exercise checks and balances, also limiting the independence of the media. I mean, I think the good thing from the Hungarian population's point of view, if you, like me, believe that generally democracy, dignity, and individual liberty are good things, the fact that Hungary is in the European Union is, in the end, I think, going to serve the Hungarian population well. And it's going to make it a lot harder, I think, for the Russians to exercise any direct influence there. Besides which, I see Russian politics as changing in ways that are positive also for the Russian population, and probably in the long term harmful for the more authoritarian figures that Russia unfortunately still lives under. So I don't see that as a big problem. I more see it as a problem for the specific populations in Central Eastern Europe and also for the minorities living in those countries. They are likely to be, the minorities particularly, are the first populations likely to suffer if politics takes